Title: The Obscured Exorcism. Main story: Tania Daniels loved the countryside of Atlanta. The tranquility and the picturesque beauty of the place always fascinated her. Her son, Thomas, too, loved the place, even though he was a teenager. They were living in a small, cozy cottage, surrounded by lush green fields and towering trees. One night, Tania woke up to the sound of her son's screams. She rushed to his room, only to find him writhing in pain. His eyes were wide open, but he wasn't responding to anything she said. She tried to shake him, but he remained motionless. Suddenly, Thomas's body started to contort in unnatural ways. Tania was horrified as she watched him twist and turn like a snake. She realized that her son was possessed by an evil spirit. Panicked, Tania called the local priest, Father Rodriguez. The priest arrived quickly and performed an exorcism on Thomas. But the demon was too powerful. The exorcism only seemed to enrage it further. Tania and Father Rodriguez knew they needed to take Thomas to a more experienced exorcist. They rushed to the city, with the possessed teenager in tow. As they drove through the dark, winding roads, Tania felt the presence of evil all around them. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the stench of rotting flesh, and the wind whispered sinister promises. Tania tried to focus on the road, but her mind kept going back to her son's contorted body. She couldn't help but wonder if they would make it in time. Finally, they reached the church where the renowned exorcist, Father Matthews, was waiting for them. As they entered the church, Tania felt a sense of relief. She knew they were in safe hands. Father Matthews was a tall, imposing figure with piercing blue eyes. He listened intently as Tania and Father Rodriguez told him about Thomas's possession. Then, he took a deep breath and entered the room where Thomas lay. Tania watched through the window as Father Matthews started the exorcism. At first, nothing happened. But then, Thomas's body started to convulse violently. Tania felt her heart pounding in her chest as she watched her son's ordeal. And then, something unexpected happened. The demon possessing Thomas suddenly spoke. "You cannot defeat me, Father," it hissed. "I am far too powerful for you." Father Matthews didn't falter. "We shall see about that," he replied calmly. And then, the exorcism took a strange turn. The demon's voice changed, becoming more human-like. "Please, Father," it begged. "Let me stay. I promise I won't harm anyone. I just want to be free." Father Matthews paused for a moment, considering the demon's request. And then, he made his decision. "No," he said firmly. "You must leave this body and return to where you belong." With a final shout, the demon left Thomas's body. Tania watched in amazement as her son's body relaxed, his breathing becoming steady. The exorcism was over, but Tania couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. As they left the church, she couldn't help but glance back at the towering building. She felt a sense of dread, as if the evil they had just defeated was still lurking around them. And then, she heard Father Matthews's voice behind her. "I hope you know what you're doing, Tania," he said. "The demon you just expelled was one of the most powerful ones I've ever encountered. Be careful, and stay alert." Tania felt a chill run down her spine. She looked back at Father Matthews, who had a grave expression on his face. "What do you mean?" she asked. Father Matthews sighed. "The demon you just expelled wasn't just any demon," he said. "It was a powerful entity known as Vorkin, one of the 7 princes of hell." Tania felt her blood run cold. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Matthews looked at her gravely. "It means that Vorkin will not give up so easily," he said. "He will seek revenge. He will come for you and your son." Tania felt her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at her son, who was sleeping peacefully in the back seat of the car. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. Father Matthews nodded. "I suggest you leave Atlanta," he said. "Go far away. Change your name. Start a new life." Tania nodded, her mind reeling. She knew Father Matthews was right. They had to leave. As they drove back to the countryside, Tania couldn't shake off the feeling of dread. She felt as if they were being watched, as if the evil they had just defeated was still lurking around them. And then, it happened. A car suddenly appeared out of nowhere, its headlights blinding Tania. She swerved to avoid it, but it was too late. The car hit them head-on, sending their vehicle spinning out of control. Tania felt herself being thrown around in the car, her body slamming against the door. She heard Thomas screaming, and then everything went black. When she came to, Tania was lying in a hospital bed. She looked around groggily, trying to make sense of what had happened. And then, she saw him. Vorkin standing at the foot of her bed. His eyes glowing with malevolent energy. "You cannot escape me, Tania," he hissed. "I will follow you to the ends of the earth." Tania tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt herself being dragged down into the abyss, into a world of darkness and terror. And then, she woke up. It had all been a nightmare. But as she looked out the window, she saw a dark figure standing in the shadows, watching her. She knew then that her nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Tania sat up in bed, her heart racing. Was it real or just her imagination? She looked again, but the figure had vanished. Her son Thomas was still sleeping soundly in the bed beside hers. Tania tried to calm herself down and took a few deep breaths. Maybe it was just the medication playing tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Vorkin was still out there, waiting for his revenge. The next few days were a blur. Tania couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of being followed. She tried to stay calm for Thomas's sake, but inside, she was terrified. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, they heard a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. Tania grabbed a baseball bat and cautiously opened the door. And there, standing on their doorstep, was Father Matthews. "Tania, we have to talk," he said, his voice urgent. Tania let him in, feeling relieved to see a familiar face. But she knew there was something wrong. Father Matthews looked pale and scared. Like he had seen a ghost. "What's going on?" she asked. Father Matthews took a deep breath. "I've done some research, and I've found out some disturbing things," he said. "Vorkin is not just any demon. He has a particular interest in possessing young boys, especially those with a gift for the dark arcane." "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means that Vorkin has his eyes set on Thomas," Father Matthews said gravely. "He wants to possess him, to use him as a vessel for his evil deeds." Tania felt her heart sink. She knew they had to do something, but what? Father Matthews pulled out a small vial from his pocket. "This is holy water," he said. "It can protect Thomas from Vorkin's influence. But you have to be careful. Vorkin is powerful, and he won't go down without a fight." Tania took the vial, feeling a sense of hopelessness. How could they possibly fight against a demon as powerful as Vorkin? But she knew they had no choice. She had to protect her son, no matter what the cost. That night, as they went to bed, Tania placed the vial of holy water under Thomas's pillow, praying it would keep him safe. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard a voice whispering in her ear. Vorkin's voice. "You cannot hide from me, Tania," he said. "I will find you. And when I do, I will destroy you." Tania tried to block out the voice, but it was no use. Vorkin had already found them. And this time, there was nowhere to run. Tania woke up in the middle of the night, feeling a strange presence in the room. She looked over at Thomas, but he was fast asleep. She got out of bed and tiptoed towards the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. But as she reached for the doorknob, she felt a cold hand grab her wrist. Tania turned around, and there he was. Vorkin, standing right in front of her. His eyes were glowing red, and his face contorted into a sinister grin. "I told you. I would find you," he said, his voice echoing through the room. Tania tried to pull away, but Baal's grip was too strong. She could feel his power coursing through her veins, threatening to take over. But then, she remembered the vial of holy water under Thomas's pillow. With a burst of strength, she broke free from Vorkin's grasp and ran towards the bed. She pulled out the vial and splashed the holy water onto Vorkin's face. He let out a deafening scream, his body writhing in pain. Tania knew she had to act fast. She grabbed Thomas and ran out of the room, with Baal's screams echoing behind them. They ran through the dark corridors of the house, with Vorkin's presence always lurking in the shadows. But then, they reached the front door. Tania grabbed the keys and opened it, letting in a beam of moonlight that illuminated the darkness. But as they stepped outside, they realized it was not over yet. Vorkin was still there, waiting for them. He emerged from the shadows, his eyes burning with rage. Tania could feel the terror rising inside her, but she knew she couldn't give up. With a fierce determination, she splashed the holy water onto Vorkin. Once again. This time, he let out a final scream. And then, he was gone. Tania and Thomas stood there for a moment, catching their breath. They had defeated Vorkin, but they knew he would never truly be gone. As they walked back into the house, they realized the full extent of the damage. The walls were covered in blood, and the furniture was overturned. But Tania knew they had survived. And as long as they had each other, they could face anything that came their way. They had faced the horror of Vorkin, and they had come out victorious. But they knew they could never forget what had happened that night, and they knew they could never let their guard down, for as long as they lived, they would always remember the horror of Baal, and the power of the holy water that had saved them from his grip. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Tania and Thomas had managed to move on from the horror of Vorkin, but they both knew that the memory of that night would stay with them forever. Despite their efforts to move on, strange things still happened in their house. Objects moved on their own, doors opened and closed by themselves, and they could hear whispers. In the dead of night. Tania tried to ignore it, but she knew that Vorkin was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. One night, Tania woke up to find Thomas missing from his bed. She searched the whole house, but he was nowhere to be found. As she walked into the living room, she saw a strange figure standing in the corner. It was Vorkin, and he had come back for revenge. Tania knew what she had to do. She reached for the holy water that she had kept close by. But it was gone. She was defenseless. Vorkin started to move towards her, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Tania tried to run, but he was too fast. He grabbed her by the neck and lifted her off the ground. "You cannot defeat me," he hissed, his grip tightening on her throat. But then, something strange happened. Thomas appeared out of nowhere, holding the vial of holy water in his hand. He splashed it onto Vorkin's face, and the demon let out a deafening scream. Tania fell to the ground, gasping for air. Thomas continued to splash the holy water onto Vorkin. His face contorted with rage. "You will never hurt my family again," he yelled. Vorkin tried to fight back, but the holy water was too much for him. His body started to disintegrate, and he vanished into thin air. Tania and Thomas sat there, catching their breath. They had defeated Vorkin once again, but they both knew that he would always be a threat. As they looked around the room, they saw the damage that Vorkin had caused. But they also saw the strength that they had within them. They had faced their fear head-on. And they had come out victorious. From that night on, Tania and Thomas knew that they would always be ready for whatever came their way. They had faced the horror of Vorken twice, and they had emerged stronger than ever before. But they also knew that they could never let their guard down. For as long as they lived, they would always remember the horror of Vorken, and they would always be ready to fight back. In the aftermath of their battle with Vorken, Tania and Thomas decided to leave their home in the countryside and move back to the city. They hoped that by doing so, they could start anew and leave the horrors of their past behind them. But as they settled into their new home, they began to realize that the demons they had faced were not limited to just one location. Strange occurrences continued to happen. And they could feel the presence of evil lurking around them. Tania knew that they couldn't keep running forever. They needed to find a way to rid themselves of this darkness once and for all. They decided to seek out the help of a psychic medium, who could communicate with the spirits and possibly help them find a solution. The medium led them through a series of rituals, incantations, and prayers. They sat in a circle, holding hands, as the medium called forth the spirits. Suddenly, the room grew cold, and a dark presence filled the air. Tania and Thomas could feel a weight pressing down on them, as if something was trying to enter their bodies. The medium began to chant in an ancient language, and Tania and Thomas could see a faint light glowing in the center of the circle. As the medium continued to chant, the light grew brighter and brighter, until it exploded into a blinding flash. When Tania and Thomas opened their eyes, they saw that the room had been transformed. The dark presence was gone, and the room was filled with a warm, welcoming light. The medium smiled at them and said, "You have faced the darkness and emerged victorious. You have the strength and the power to overcome any obstacle. You are no longer bound by fear, but are free to live your lives in peace and joy." Tania and Thomas hugged each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. They had finally found the closure they had been seeking, and they knew that they could face whatever came their way. As they left the medium's house, they felt a renewed sense of purpose and strength. They knew that their battle with Vorken had not been in vain, and that they had the power to face any challenge that lay ahead. And as they walked out into the sunlight, they felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons they had learned, and for the strength they had gained through their struggles. They knew that they would never forget the horror of Vorken, but they also knew that they would never again let fear rule their lives. The end.